We are on Chapter 7 of Occult Feminism, The Secret History of Women's Liberation by Rachel Wilson. Like I said, Chapter 7, A Brave New World. With the passage of the 19th Amendment in the United States on August 26, 1920, and the passage of partial women's suffrage in England in 1918, a brand new era was ushered in. Both countries had just come out of World War I, and the Roaring Twenties had begun. An economic boom in the West, combined with a spirit of decadence and prosperity, launched the new liberated woman into the mainstream. The flapper girls of the Roaring Twenties flaunted their disdain for traditional social expectations of women, rejecting feminine style and social norms of the Victorian era. They cut their hair short, wore short skirts, smoked, danced, drank, and drove automobiles. The curvy body type that had been in fashion for so long also went out of style, and slender boyish frames were in. They no longer had chaperones or curfews. Instead, they went to parties and treated sex more casually than the Victorian era feminists. With this newfound, albeit limited, sexual freedom came increased concern for preventing pregnancy. Technological advancement was happening at a very fast pace at the dawn of the 20th century, making things like electricity, automobiles, movies, and air travel possible. Advancements in biology and medicine were creating questions about the ethics of using science to control fertility and reproduction. Eugenics, the idea that the biological quality of humans could be improved using scientific technology, was front and center for the first half of the 20th century. This is also where we see a move towards secular scientism, and away from Christianity blossom into full-blown humanist and transhumanist ideas, which came to govern powerful global policy-making organizations like the United Nations and many influential non-governmental organizations. We begin to see a lot of cooperation between secular humanists and occultists due to the overlap in their goals. The widespread popularity of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution also helped revive ideas about population control among the neo-Malthusians in England, and the intellectual elite began to dream that science and technology might help them usher in utopia by providing a means to control reproduction and, therefore, mankind. Governments had a vested interest in funding this research in the hopes that they could reduce or eliminate heritable birth defects, disease, and other perceived weaknesses in their populations. Eugenics research went hand in hand with the arms race after the First World War, with nation-states hoping to create better soldiers and fitter populations that could better survive another mass conflict. Just as we saw most feminists of the 19th century involved in spiritualism, in the 20th century we see most feminists involved with eugenics, abortion, and birth control. The first wave of Western feminism was mostly about law, and the second wave was about sexual and reproductive revolution. Perhaps the most famous example of this is Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger. Sanger was born the sixth child out of 11 as Margaret Higgins in 1879. Her parents were Irish immigrants who had settled in New York, and Sanger's mother died at the age of 49. I've seen numerous biographies on the internet which say the cause of her death was her 18 pregnancies and 11 births, but this is not true. Mrs. Higgins died of tuberculosis, but many feminist writers and bloggers have a vested interest in justifying some of Margaret Sanger's most controversial views, so they try to attribute her mother's death to having too many children, in order to stoke a sympathy for Sanger's cause, when the truth is that Mrs. Higgins died of one of the most common scourges of the time. They also try to overplay the hardships of Sanger coming from a large family, which seems so foreign to us today, but was not at all uncommon at the time. Margaret Sanger certainly did have a negative view of being the middle child of a large family, but of course there are a great many people from such families who don't see it that way at all. My great-grandfather was one of 14 children, none of whom counted this as a burden, as far as I know. This is quite obviously a matter of perspective, but in feminist academia it is always portrayed as a negative and a hardship, mostly in order to justify abortion. Margaret married German-Jewish architect William Sanger in 1902, but her political activism began in 1911 when she joined the Women's Committee of the New York Socialist Party. This began her association with a bohemian circle of artists and intellectuals in New York at the time, and she soon became interested in feminism. Sanger had a background in nursing, and this combined with her new radical politics in the form of writing pieces on sex education. These were called What Every Mother Should Know and What Every Girl Should Know. These columns appeared in the socialist magazine, The New York Call. One of Sanger's most famous quotes is, "No woman can call herself free until she can choose consciously whether she will or will not be a mother." But something most people don't know at the time, and many still don't know today, is that Sanger likely fabricated her most famous personal account of tending to a patient suffering the effects of botched self-induced abortion during this time in an effort to propagandize the subject. She often publicly told the story of a woman she treated in her nursing days who died after 2 attempts at abortion named Sadie Sachs. The story included a male doctor who unsympathetically laughed at the woman and told her to make her husband sleep on the roof and that she could not have her cake and eat it too. Sanger biographer Ellen Chassler made an effort to corroborate the story and found no evidence of Sanger ever having met or treated such a person. She couldn't find any record that the patient even existed, which should be possible given the very detailed account, including the general time and place. Other fans of Sanger have also tried to find evidence supporting Sanger's tale and failed. Therefore, it is accepted among several Sanger biographers that Sanger made up this and possibly other similar stories to propagandize the issue. At this point in my research on feminism, I had already noticed a distinct pattern of lies, forgery, and fraud. Given this, I wondered just how many of the dramatic assertions from feminists about the proliferation of back-alley abortions were true, and how many were fear-mongering abortion propaganda. With just a little research, I discovered that abortion rights activists have indeed been engaged in falsifying and exaggerating a great deal of facts and figures about abortion prior to Roe v. Wade, if not imagining them altogether. The often repeated trope about desperate women seeking back-alley abortions performed by unskilled, untrained hacks is false. Before abortion was made legal in 1973, 90% of abortions were performed by physicians, and almost all the rest were performed by midwives. As I have already mentioned, prior to the medicalization of childbirth, nearly all abortions were performed by midwives who were trained and skilled in the practice. Another egregious lie that has been repeated by the media ad nauseum for decades is that prior to legalization, tens of thousands of women died every year as a result of these supposedly dangerous illegal abortions. Dr. Bernard Nathanson, co-founder of the National Abortion Rights Action League and director of the largest abortion clinic in the world during the 1970s, later admitted that leading abortion proponents knew that this figure was false, but felt it was useful as a PR tactic. Even statisticians from Planned Parenthood have admitted that abortion death statistics were very accurately kept in the years leading up to legalization. For example, there were only 39 deaths from illegal abortion in 1972. It might shock you to know that in the decades since abortion was legalized, deaths from abortion have increased, most likely as a result of abortion numbers skyrocketing after legalization. Independent studies have found that these deaths are often hidden or misrepresented on death certificates. Researchers in Finland examined women's medical records and death certificates and found that 94% of maternal deaths related to abortion were not identifiable as such from the death certificate alone. The number of illegal abortions performed annually in the U.S. was also repeatedly exaggerated roughly tenfold. I felt quite shocked and betrayed to learn these facts, because I remember being a high schooler and hearing and believing almost all these myths from the media and other sources I should have been able to trust, including my own mother, who was a volunteer for Planned Parenthood in the mid-70s. If Sanger and the abortion advocates she paved the way for truly cared so much about educating women and girls so that they could make informed choices, then why did they engage in such massive attempts at disinformation? If this problem was as dire as they proclaimed, then why propagandize and lie to such an extent? I think I have discovered the answer, but more on that later. Within 2 years of Margaret Sanger finding her new circle of radical reformer friends, she became estranged from her first husband, William, in 1913. The following events are detailed in the biography Woman of Valor by Ellen Chesler. By the time of their estrangement, the couple had 3 children, 2 boys named Grant and Stuart, and a girl named Peggy. In August of 1914, Margaret Sanger was charged with violating postal obscenity laws by mailing copies of her publication, The Woman Rebel, which contained graphic descriptions of various contraceptive methods. To avoid facing prosecution, she fled in the middle of the night to Europe without saying goodbye to her children. She was prepared to live in exile until the political climate was more favorable for her to return and hopefully avoid jail. While away in Europe, Sanger began affairs with multiple partners, while her husband Bill tried to care for the 2 younger children, while Stuart, the oldest, was at boarding school. Bill sent letters to his wife begging her to reconcile, professing his love for her and his deep desire to reunite his family. Margaret responded with a callous letter ending the relationship and asking for a divorce. A few months later, in early 1915, Bill was arrested for having distributed some of his wife's pamphlets on family limitation. Margaret was apparently frustrated that he had involved himself in her work as an apparent attempt to rekindle their romance and regain her favor. She remained in Europe and carried on affairs with multiple men. Bill was jailed for 30 days as a result of his conviction, and the 2 younger children were sent to boarding school. Her son Grant frequently wrote his mother asking when she would return so he could come home from boarding school. Margaret returned to the United States after a year in exile, but did not bother to visit Bill in jail. In November of 1915, 5-year-old Peggy became ill while at boarding school and died of pneumonia. Young Grant lamented that if only his mother had been there, little Peggy wouldn't have gotten so sick. This tragedy solidified the end of the Sanger marriage, which was formally ended in 1921. According to Chesler, Sanger spent even more time away from her sons in the years after Peggy's death. Another Sanger biography, Margaret Sanger, a biography of the champion of birth control, quotes her son Grant as saying, "Mother was seldom around. She just left us with anybody handy and ran off. We didn't know where." Back in Europe, devastated and racked with guilt over her daughter's death, Margaret Sanger dabbled in Rosicrucian occult rituals, which were introduced to her by Havelock Ellis, a sexologist who was also one of her lovers. The rituals were meant to help her contact the spirit of her dead daughter. Sanger had contempt for traditional religion for the same reasons as most feminists. She wanted to be free to take casual lovers and travel the world working. But she, like others, felt she could combine science with occult spiritualism in a way that left her free to do as she pleased and allowed her to discover the God within and become empowered. Rosicrucian spiritualism offered a spiritual dimension to Sanger's worldview, which was not one of service to God, but of self-enrichment. Sanger's entire struggle was about liberation from obligation to anyone but herself and making herself her own God. Sanger, like many of the women we've covered so far in this book, hung out with many famous artists, radicals, and intellectuals of her time. Many of these became her lovers as well. We cannot understand what motivated Margaret Sanger without understanding a little bit about the handful of people she says were her biggest influences. H.G. Wells was certainly one of those people. Wells called Sanger the greatest woman in the world. The movement she started will grow to be, 100 years from now, the most influential of all time in controlling man's destiny on earth. The affair between the two started in 1920 but remained intermittent until Wells' death in 1946. Wells and Sanger were both believers in the same free love as Victoria Woodhull, and thus both had many other lovers in their lifetime. Wells was married to his cousin, but the two separated after only 3 years of marriage when Wells had an affair with one of his students. Wells' scandalous affairs, with much younger progressive feminist women, are too numerous to mention here, except to say that he was not only one of the most influential writers of the early 20th century, but also an enormous influence on Margaret Sanger. Both Sanger and Wells' fathers were free thinkers. Wells studied Darwinian biology early in his career and was a student of Thomas Henry Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog. Wells co-authored a book with Thomas Huxley's grandson, Julian Huxley, and his own son, G.P. Wells, called The Science of Life. The book was meant to explain Darwinian theories of biology, as well as the psychological and behavioral theories of Carl Jung, to the masses of time. Wells became more opposed to traditional religion as he aged, and became a harsh critic of the Roman Catholic Church, another thing he shared with Sanger. It's clear Wells' ideas on biology, transhumanism, and futurism contributed to Sanger's thinking on these issues. Another of Sanger's most important influences was her friend and lover, early British sexologist Havelock Ellis. Sanger's book, The Pivot of Civilization, opens with a quote from Ellis. "I dream of a world in which the spirits of women are flames stronger than fire, a world in which modesty has become courage and yet remains modesty, a world in which women are as unlike men as they ever were in the world I sought to destroy, a world in which women shine with a loveliness of self-revelation as enchanting as ever the old legends told, and yet a world which would immeasurably transcend the old world in the self-sacrificing passion of human service. I have dreamed of that world ever since I began to dream at all." Margaret Sanger's book, Woman and the New Race, includes a preface by Ellis as well. When he was 32, Havelock Ellis married Edith Lees, an openly lesbian feminist woman with whom he had an open marriage. The couple maintained separate residences and never had children. Lees had numerous lesbian affairs of which Ellis was aware. The Sophia Smith collection of women's history has a large archive of Sanger's personal correspondence, and the description of the contents includes personal letters revealing a long affair between Ellis and Sanger, as well as affairs both had with others while still married. An interesting side note I found in this archive says that Sanger's collection also includes material collected by her on theosophy and writings of Annie Besant, who was the first woman to publicly endorse birth control in 1877. Ellis apparently suffered from frequent trouble with impotence until his 60s, when he apparently somehow discovered that the sight of a woman urinating cured the problem. Ellis called this particular fetish undination. This is the only strong personal sexual proclivity he ever spoke of having personally, and seemed otherwise asexual. Indeed, Havelock Ellis was an early pioneer of human sexual behavior research as well as psychedelic drug use. He was among the first to suggest that homosexuality was not a disease, but a natural, harmless quirk of sorts. He preferred to use the term sexual inversion to describe it. Ellis co-authored the book Sexual Inversion with John Addington Symonds, who was a proponent of homosexuality as well as pederasty. Symonds, like Ellis, was married to a woman, but Symonds also had affairs with men, whereas it is unclear whether Ellis ever did. Ellis also studied transgenderism along with his contemporary, the infamous Magnus Hirschfeld. Ellis preferred a separate term, sexo-aesthetic inversion, but later called the phenomenon eonism. Ellis also had extremely controversial views on sexuality in children, and in his book Psychology of Sex, wrote of case studies involving masturbation in children as young as 3 or 4. He asserted that children were capable of a wide range of genital and sexual aptitude. Like Sanger, Ellis was a committed eugenicist who served as vice president of the Eugenics Education Society. In his book, The Task of Social Hygiene, Ellis writes, "The superficial, sympathetic man flings a coin to the beggar. The more deeply sympathetic man builds an almshouse for him, so he need no longer beg. But perhaps the most radically sympathetic of all is the man who arranges that the beggar shall not be born." Ellis was also a member of the Eugenics Society. Concerning Ellis' religious beliefs, he wrote, "Had there been a lunatic asylum in the suburbs of Jerusalem, Jesus Christ would infallibly have been shut up in it at the outset of his public career. The interview with Satan on the pinnacle of the temple would alone have damned him, and everything that happened after could but have confirmed the diagnosis." Ellis wrote this in 1914, the same year Margaret Sanger started her publication, The Woman Rebel, which had as its slogan the phrase, "No gods, no masters." Sanger was again charged under Comstock laws for the distribution of the magazine and went to England to avoid prosecution. There she met neo-Malthusians like Charles Vickery Drysdale, whose primary concern was controlling population growth, which fit nicely with Sanger and Ellis's ideas on eugenics. In addition to all of this, Havelock Ellis was also a pioneer in Western use of mescaline, a hallucinogenic drug. He detailed his experimentation with the drug in an essay called Mescal, A New Artificial Paradise. Of his experience, he wrote that mescaline was magical, enabling him to visit an optical fairyland, and he shared some of the drug with famous poet and occultist W.B. Yeats, who was also a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Mescaline has since been widely used in New Age and occult ceremonies in the West. Another associate of Sanger who influenced her work was radical anarcha-feminist and committed atheist Emma Goldman, who shared the view of most first-wave feminists that Christianity was particularly oppressive to women. Goldman was considered very radical for her time. She was born to an Orthodox Jewish family in Russia and immigrated to the United States as a teenager, only to be deported in the Red Scare of 1919 due to her radical anarchist activities. Goldman was a radical feminist who supported sexual liberation, contraception, and acceptance of homosexuality. She was also a strong critic of marriage. Goldman distributed Sanger's pamphlet, Family Limitation, and both women were arrested under Comstock laws for distribution of obscene material. Aside from her intellectual and activist circles, Margaret Sanger also made many friends and associates in her efforts to gain funding for her clinics and other projects. After she divorced her first husband and left her 2 remaining sons to caretakers so she could travel and work unencumbered, she married James Noah H. Slee in 1922. I wondered why a woman who believed in free love and didn't want to be tied down to children would bother marrying again, but it turns out that Mr. Slee was a wealthy businessman who produced a popular household oil, and the two had an open marriage until the much older Mr. Slee died in 1943. Mr. Slee also became the first manufacturer of diaphragms, a popular method of birth control prior to the birth control pill. Sanger opened her clinical research bureau with anonymous funding from John D. Rockefeller Jr. in 1923. Rockefeller and his family continued to provide major financial support for Sanger and her clinics, which eventually opened worldwide as Planned Parenthood International. Rockefeller Jr. had already opened the Bureau of Social Hygiene in 1913, which was another organization that promoted population control and eugenics. Rockefeller was raised a Baptist, but was an ecumenist in the most extreme sense. That is, he wanted all Protestant sects to merge and become a singular entity. He took this much further when he built the massive, ambitious Riverside Church in New York City, which opened in 1930. Riverside is an enormous interdenominational church, which was the brainchild of Rockefeller and ultra-progressive minister Harry Fosdick. The church is a monument to their idea of blending the world's religions into one worldwide faith, and its interior includes iconographic artwork featuring not only Jesus, but also Confucius, Buddha, Muhammad, Socrates, Kant, Hegel, Einstein, Darwin, and many others. This reflects Rockefeller's goal of not only reforming Christianity into a sort of liberal humanism, but to reconcile and combine it with science and evolution. This is a common thread of New Age occultism, a one-world religion. Rockefeller later donated the land for the UN headquarters in Manhattan, which houses the interfaith New Age UN Spiritual Caucus. The Rockefeller family has been one of the major funders of feminist causes around the world ever since. There has been plenty of criticism of Sanger in the last decade since the internet has brought to light her racist eugenic views, and rightly so. However, it is not often mentioned that Sanger allied herself with some other very ethically dubious people in order to realize her dream of a magic pill that could prevent pregnancy. Sanger's publication, The Birth Control Review, started in 1917, regularly featured the work of German researcher Ernst Rudin, who studied psychiatric and mental disorders with Emil Kraepelin, the father of modern scientific psychiatry, at the Kaiser Wilhelm Society for the Advancement of Science in Germany. Once more, the German-American Rockefeller family was responsible for most of the funding which established Kraepelin and Rudin's work at Kaiser Wilhelm. Both were eugenicists and advocates of racial hygiene, a theory of social Darwinist eugenics which the Rockefellers were already promoting in America. Rudin was a member of the Nazi Expert Committee on Questions of Population and Racial Policy, where he advocated for the sterilization of people considered mentally or physically unfit. Rudin was also a member of the Nazi Party and received 2 awards for his eugenics work from Adolf Hitler himself. Rudin even gave public speeches where he spoke of the value of eliminating young children of clearly inferior quality. Sanger had similar feelings about children, as she illustrates in the famous quote from her 1920 book, Woman and the New Race. The most merciful thing that a large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it. In 1951, Sanger met with physiologist Gregory Pincus, who was a leading researcher on synthesizing human hormones. Pincus was born to a Russian Jewish family who came to the United States at the turn of the century. Pincus was a genius who had an Ivy League education. He studied reproduction in mammals, and in 1951, Sanger met with Pincus to discuss formation of a hormone pill that could stop ovulation, a birth control pill. They needed funding for such an endeavor, so Sanger went to her very wealthy friend and fellow feminist, Catherine McCormick, for help. McCormick was a former suffragette who married Stanley McCormick, heir to the international harvester fortune. Not long after the couple were married, Stanley began to show signs of worsening mental illness. Stanley suffered from many bizarre compulsive behaviors, such as washing and drying his hands until they chafed, and obsessive-compulsive masturbation, which became so severe that Stanley slept in a self-made harness which strapped his wrists to his ankles. He had intense fear and anger regarding women and sex and was unable to consummate his marriage with Catherine. In 1908, he went to stay with his family at their sprawling Riven Rock estate in California, where Catherine and the McCormick family brought in some of the leading doctors and psychiatrists of the time to treat Stanley. They recommended Stanley be isolated from women completely, including his wife, mother, and sisters. Stanley was confined to the second floor of the mansion and was sometimes allowed to walk the grounds, where he would be doused with hoses and sprinklers if he suffered any manic attacks while on his walk. The Riven Rock estate in California is now occupied by Prince Harry and his wife Meghan, and it is also interesting to note that Stanley McCormick's brother Harold married Edith Rockefeller, the daughter of John D. Rockefeller Jr., who was funding Margaret Sanger's Planned Parenthood clinics. Edith Rockefeller McCormick was a patient and supporter of psychologist and occultist Carl Jung. Edith even had her own Jungian psychology practice with over 50 patients. She also made generous donations to the Zurich Psychological Society and paid for Jung's writings to be translated into English and distributed to her elite friends. Edith studied astrology and believed in reincarnation, even claiming to have been the wife of King Tutankhamun in a past life. By now, you might be noticing that the 20th century, a handful of wealthy elites who were friends and colleagues had a mutual interest in occultic beliefs. They played a major part in the direction of humanity through their philanthropic generosity to certain causes, including feminist ones. They had a shared vision of the future which they believed could be accomplished through eugenics, globalism, and progressive social reform, all of which stemmed from a New Age occultic worldview and need for a unified humanity under a new age, one world religion. Achievement of such a goal would necessitate the dismantling of Christianity, marriage, and the family first before the world could be remade according to their vision. While at Riven Rock, the family brought Emil Kraepelin from Germany to examine Stanley. Oh, sorry about that. Marley, move. Right, over there. Sorry, guys. While at Riven Rock, the family brought Emil Kraepelin from Germany to examine Stanley. Kraepelin diagnosed him with schizophrenia. In 1909, Stanley was declared mentally incompetent to control his vast fortune. Catherine and the family shared joint control of both Stanley's estate and his care, with infighting between them until Stanley's death in 1947, when Catherine inherited 35 million, a majority of which went to inheritance taxes. Catherine McCormick was still a very wealthy woman and feminist activist who was already well acquainted with Margaret Sanger, so when Sanger came to her with exciting research by Pincus, which could result in a contraceptive pill, Catherine gladly donated the necessary funds. By 1960, Pincus had created the first FDA-approved contraceptive pill, paving the way for the final stages of women's liberation and the sexual revolution. There is no doubt that Margaret Sanger changed the world with her fight to make birth control and abortion legal, and accepted not only in the West, but across the world. The effects of her work were so revolutionary, they are hard to quantify. And since her death in 1966, there has been much controversy about her ideas, mostly concerning race and eugenics. Since so much has been said about that subject, and this book is about feminism, I won't go into detail on my personal views about it. I would, however, like to contribute my opinion as a mother of 5 children who has also suffered 3 miscarriages, about how deeply Sanger affected the public opinion of motherhood in general. She had very little positive to say about motherhood, referring to it as slavery, a trap, and calling women who had more than a couple of children breeders. Here is a brief excerpt from Chapter 3 of her 1928 book, Motherhood in Bondage. There is a certain type of mother who can be best described as a breeder. She is endowed by nature for the function of motherhood. Often gifted with a splendid physical constitution, she seems to inherit a predisposition to pregnancy. These women are caught early and never released from the trap of involuntary maternity. These mothers may be fairly said to exemplify the typical American mother, the mother worshipped in our popular songs, stories, and motion pictures. They reveal themselves heroically, willing to make any sacrifice for their children. They work like slaves to provide food, clothing, shelter, and education for their ever-growing brood. In the appended documents, we find the confessions of women, the majority of whom have passed their 30th year, and many of whom are approaching or past 40, who have enjoyed no surcease from the endless drudgery of childbearing, who are pathetically begging for release from the long slavery they have suffered and are still enduring. I am extremely dubious about the authenticity of this book and the letters inside it. The Margaret Sanger Papers Project claims almost all of these were likely destroyed by clinics they were sent to, or by associates of Sanger, or were lost to time. They are also anonymous, so I can't imagine that you could ever prove the veracity of the letters almost a century later. They all read like horror stories and are just a bit too similar, sounding like they were written by the same person and possibly exaggerated. This is just my personal perception of the book, not an accusation of forgery. Sure, motherhood is not without its difficulties, and there are certainly some women who don't enjoy it. I'm not saying there were not aspects of motherhood in the early 20th century that might seem horrific to modern women. However, you have to be blind not to notice the implications of this and so many other passages written by Sanger. She seems to have disdain and even jealousy of attractive women who are seen as fit mothers by men, and therefore tend to marry early and have more children. Sanger was a woman who put her cause above her own children, which she admitted. I am very skeptical of many of Sanger's claims of receiving hundreds of thousands of letters from women claiming to be desperate for some knowledge on how to prevent the birth of more children. In addition, I have some direct personal knowledge from my own grandmother, who was born in 1926 and is still alive as I write this at the age of 95. She has all her faculties intact, and I asked her about her mother and grandparents' knowledge of family planning. Her own mother, who lived to be 102 years old, and who I knew well, as I was 19 when she passed, had 4 children between 1922 and 1927. My grandmother tells me that her mother's doctor advised the couple on how to space out or avoid more births. There was no restriction of this information, and the couple were easily able to prevent any further births by, as Grandma put it, being careful and avoiding certain things. When I asked her about whether great-grandma was prevented from understanding how to avoid pregnancy, she said, "That's absurd. Dr. Lanning told her anything she wanted to know, and it obviously worked since your Aunt Thelma was the last of us kids to be born." As a mother of 5 who has done several public debates and interviews about feminism, motherhood, and women's liberation, I have made many enemies. I have been called a breeder and a baby factory. So seeing these terms used by Sanger really stuck me, and I realized where this incredibly derogatory term had come from. It is so prevalent in our modern Western society now that any woman who has more than the average 1.7 children is referred to in a negative way. I have 5, and I have 2 Catholic friends who have 7 and 11 children. We share stories about people calling us crazy or asking us if we need a new hobby. I have been accused of being too stupid, lazy, or unambitious to have a real career. I have been told I will regret wasting my life. This is in no small part due to decades of propaganda that have dominated the media since Sanger rose to infamy. Thanks to the work of Sanger and her Malthusian friends, the world, especially the West, is now facing a population collapse. Most of the world now has fertility rates below replacement levels, and in the U.S., we are at an all-time low of 1.6 births on average per woman over her lifetime. In 2021, the Wall Street Journal reported on statistics released by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention stating, in half of all states last year, more people died than were born, up from 5 states in 2019. Early estimates show the total U.S. population grew 0.35% for the year ended July 1st, 2020, the lowest ever documented, and growth is expected to remain near flat this year. Africa is an exception, but white papers, internal documents meant for use within the organization, from the Rockefeller Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation explain that their goal is to further reduce birth rates around the world, especially in Africa and India, through birth control and abortion initiatives, which are always described as healthcare or empowerment for women and girls. What is amazing to me is that at the time Sanger began fear-mongering about the dangers of too much reckless breeding, the U.S. birth rate had already tumbled from 7.03 in 1800 to 3.64 in 1910, a decrease of nearly half. This was due to a number of factors, including the Industrial Revolution. By 1940, the birth rate was already down to 2.06, thanks in no small part to Sanger's propaganda, clinics, and distribution of diaphragms, but had begun to rise again in the post-World War II era of prosperity known as the baby boom. When the contraceptive pill was approved by the FDA in 1960, birth rates took another nosedive from 3.58 to 1.77 in just 20 years. The legalization of abortion in the 70s contributed to this as well. Yet even during those years when birth rates had begun to drop below replacement, overpopulation propaganda continued to dominate the media with books like the now debunked Population Bomb, released in 1968 by Paul Ehrlich. Despite the book's wildly inaccurate predictions of dire famine, skyrocketing death rates, and starvation caused by too much breeding, the book had major cultural and academic impact. Warnings of overpopulation causing every imaginable catastrophe from starvation to pandemics to climate disaster have been based on the same general concepts put forth by the same circles of intellectuals for the last 2 centuries. All share the same worldview and perception of humanity as a scourge on the planet which must be managed, controlled, and reduced by the ruling class who have combined ancient occult beliefs with science and progress to produce this anti-Christian, anti-human ideas about what the world should be. Much of what we perceive to be political battles on these subjects are spiritual battles, which have existed from the time of Plato or before and continue now. Essentially, there are two diametrically opposed views at war here. One which sees mankind as the image bearers of a loving God who said, "Go forth and multiply," whose existence is a gift, and the other which sees human existence as something wretched and miserable to be transcended and escaped from. The National Right to Life Committee estimates that over 62 million abortions have taken place in the United States since Roe v. Wade in 1973. Abortion has now become legal across much of the world, with only Africa, some of South America, and parts of Southwest Asia not having legalized abortion. The World Health Organization says that an estimated 73 million abortions take place worldwide each year. It also says that 61% of all unwanted pregnancies and a whopping 29% of all pregnancies now end in abortion. Sanger's champions always try to say she was against abortion, but her organization, International Planned Parenthood Federation, is the largest provider of abortions worldwide, and the NGO states that one of its main goals now is to expand its services to Africa and South American countries, which happen to be the places where the birth rate is still above replacement levels. It's naive and frankly absurd to believe that this has nothing to do with the depopulation agenda of its founders and current operators. Sanger was only against abortion in so much as she wanted to prevent pregnancy in the first place. Her ideas on motherhood and humanity can be summed up in one short quote she gave during a John Parsons interview in 1947. "But for my view, I believe that there should be no more babies." That is the end of chapter 7. I apologize for the interruption in the middle via Marley, who is now snoring over in the corner. Have a great day.